Welcome to Sleepy Middle-earth. In this calm documentary, we will follow the complete story told in The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, tracing its events chapter by chapter, exactly as they unfold on screen. This is not a comparison with the books, nor an interpretation beyond the series itself, but a faithful chronicle of its narrative, characters, and themes, told slowly and without interruption. Settle in, relax, and allow the world of Middle-earth at the dawn of the Second Age to unfold once more. The world presented at the beginning of the series is one shaped by the memory of an ancient war that never truly ended in the minds of those who survived it. A world attempting to move forward while still carrying the unresolved weight of destruction, loss, and unfinished vengeance. And this tension defines the emotional and political landscape of Middle-earth as the Second Age unfolds on screen. Because although Morgoth has been defeated and his army scattered, the series establishes immediately that peace is fragile, contested, and unevenly accepted, particularly among the elves, whose immortality renders memory both a gift and a burden. And through the opening narration, the audience is shown a time of unity during the war against Morgoth, followed by its catastrophic cost as entire realms are ruined and countless lives extinguished, leaving behind a victory that feels incomplete because evil has been defeated in form but not in certainty, and it is within this uncertainty that the story takes root, presenting Middle-earth not as a healed land, but as one suspended between relief and denial, and nowhere is this suspension more evident than among the elves of the northern reaches, who are shown guarding the remnants of Morgoth's strongholds long after the war has officially ended, driven by the belief that evil, once defeated, does not simply vanish but waits to return. And this belief is embodied most clearly in Galadriel, whose role in the opening chapter establishes the central conflict of the series, because while others seek closure and restoration, she refuses to accept that the enemy has truly been destroyed, interpreting the lingering scars of the war not as echoes of the past but as signs of an imminent resurgence. And the series carefully frames this refusal not as madness or obsession, but as a clash of perspectives, showing how victory can mean different things to different survivors, especially when grief has no natural end, and as Galadriel leads her company into the frozen wastes in pursuit of the last traces of the enemy. The environment itself reflects the emotional state of the world, hostile, barren, and resistant to renewal, reinforcing the idea that the war has altered not only political boundaries, but the very texture of existence. And when her companions ultimately refuse to follow her further, the moment marks an early thematic turning point, because it illustrates how even among allies, the desire for peace can become indistinguishable from the desire to forget. And this fracture within the elves mirrors the broader condition of Middle-earth, where unity forged in war begins to dissolve under the strain of divergent hopes for the future. And as Galadriel is ordered to return and accept the reward of passage into the Undying Lands, the series introduces a powerful contrast between institutional closure and personal unrest, because while the elven leadership frames the war as concluded and honorably resolved, Galadriel experiences this conclusion as premature and hollow, sensing that the absence of visible enemies does not equate to the absence of threat, and this tension establishes the central question of the chapter, whether peace declared by authority can override the lived experience of those who continue to feel the shadow of loss. And this question is not confined to the elves, but echoes across other storylines introduced in parallel, as the series shifts to different regions of Middle-earth to show how the aftermath of the war has affected various peoples in uneven ways, particularly in lands once aligned with Morgoth, where fear, suspicion, and inherited guilt shape daily life. And through these scenes, the series emphasizes that the end of war does not bring uniform reconciliation, but instead creates new hierarchies of blame and survival, and this is especially evident in the Southlands, where human communities live under the weight of ancestral association with darkness, struggling to redefine themselves in a world that no longer trusts them, and this inherited mistrust illustrates how the legacy of Morgoth's war continues to exert pressure on societies that had little agency in their original alignment, reinforcing the theme that evil leaves residues that persist beyond its apparent defeat. And at the same time, the series introduces a contrasting mode of survival through the Harfoots, whose nomadic existence reflects a philosophy of endurance rather than confrontation, as they move quietly through the world, avoiding attention and adapting constantly to change, embodying a form of resilience rooted not in power or memory, but in community and concealment, and their presence in the opening chapters serves as a counterpoint to the elven obsession with history and destiny, suggesting that some people survive not by confronting the past directly, but by minimizing their imprint upon it. And this juxtaposition reinforces the idea that Middle-earth is not unified by a single response to the end of war, but fragmented into multiple strategies for coping with its aftermath. And as these parallel narratives unfold, the series carefully avoids presenting any single perspective as definitively correct, instead, allowing tension to accumulate between those who seek vigilance, those who seek forgetting, and those who seek simply to endure. And this accumulation reaches a symbolic apex in the moment when Galadriel, faced with the literal threshold of departure from Middle-earth, chooses to abandon the promise of peace and return to the uncertain world she believes is still under threat, a decision that encapsulates the core conflict of the series, the refusal to accept closure when the cost of acceptance feels like betrayal. And this refusal sets into motion the chain of events that will define the season, because by rejecting the narrative of final victory, Galadriel positions herself against not only potential enemies, but the prevailing desire for resolution itself, and in doing so she exposes the fragile foundations upon which the new age has been built, foundations that rely less on certainty than on collective agreement to move on. And as the chapter closes, the world of the series is fully established as one in transition, caught between remembrance and denial, vigilance and weariness, hope and unresolved fear, a world where the absence of visible evil is not enough to guarantee peace, and where the greatest danger may lie not in the return of darkness itself, but in the willingness of its survivors to believe that it will never return. Galadriel's refusal to accept the end of the war is presented in the series not as a simple act of defiance, but as the result of a deeply personal reckoning with loss, memory, and responsibility, because unlike many of her kin, she does not experience the defeat of Morgoth as closure, but as an interruption that left too many questions unanswered and too much suffering unresolved. And this internal conflict defines her actions as the narrative follows her return from the northern wastes to Lindon, where the contrast between her certainty and the desire for peace embraced by elven leadership becomes increasingly pronounced. For while the High King and his court speak in the language of restoration and reward, framing the war as a completed chapter in history, Galadriel perceives this declaration as dangerously premature, sensing that the enemy's absence is not proof of his destruction, but a sign of concealment, and the series carefully stages this tension through dialogue and setting, presenting Lindon as a place of beauty and renewal, yet one built upon an unspoken agreement to stop looking backward, an agreement Galadriel cannot accept without betraying the memory of those who fell, including her brother, whose death remains the emotional anchor of her pursuit, and this refusal places her at odds not only with authority, but with the prevailing emotional direction of her people, because peace, in the series, is not merely a political state but a psychological necessity for a civilization weary of endless conflict, and Galadriel's insistence on vigilance is therefore framed as disruptive, even threatening, to a society that has chosen healing over suspicion. and when she is offered passage to the Undying Lands, the moment is presented as both an honor and a dismissal, a recognition of her service paired with an attempt to remove her from the field of unresolved conflict, and the ceremonial nature of the departure underscores the finality expected of this transition, as though by crossing the sea she would not only leave Middle-earth, but leave behind the very questions that define her identity. And yet the series shows that this expectation misunderstands the nature of her unrest, because her struggle is not with the world around her, but with the fear that abandoning the search would allow the past to be rewritten as resolved when it is not, and this fear culminates in her decision to reject the passage westward, an act that carries profound symbolic weight, because it represents a rejection of sanctioned peace in favor of uncertain vigilance, and this choice isolates her, transforming her from a celebrated commander into a solitary figure moving against the current of her own people's desires. And the consequences of this isolation are immediate, as her path diverges sharply from the structured world of elven authority into the unpredictable currents of the wider world, and as she encounters the open sea and the remnants of conflict beyond elven borders, the series emphasizes that her refusal of peace is not driven by ambition or pride, but by an inability to reconcile personal loss with institutional closure, and this distinction is critical, because it frames her arc not as a quest for power, but as a struggle over narrative control, over who has the right to declare an ending. And this struggle echoes across other storylines unfolding in parallel, as characters in different regions grapple with the pressure to move on from a war whose consequences remain embedded in their daily lives. And through this narrative structure, the series positions Galadriel's defiance as both an outlier and a warning, suggesting that while peace declared by authority can stabilize societies, it may also suppress unresolved truths that later return with greater force. And as the chapter unfolds, her determination begins to intersect with broader currents, shaping the world, drawing her toward encounters that will challenge her certainty even as they confirm her fears. And by the end of this segment of the story, Galadriel stands not as a hero at rest, but as a figure in motion, driven forward by a refusal to accept the simplicity of endings, embodying the central tension of the series itself, which asks whether lasting peace can be built upon forgetting, or whether the cost of forgetting is the return of the very darkness such peace seeks to escape. The Southlands are introduced in this series as a region living under the long shadow of a war it did not choose, a land defined less by its present condition than by the memory of its past allegiance. And through this setting, the narrative explores how inherited guilt and external judgment shape societies long after open conflict has ended, because the people of the Southlands are not portrayed as active servants of darkness, but as descendants of those who once followed Morgoth, burdened by a reputation they struggle to escape, and this burden manifests in the way they are governed, watched, and mistrusted, as elven wardens maintain a presence not to protect but to observe, enforcing a peace rooted in surveillance rather than reconciliation. And this arrangement establishes an uneasy balance, where order exists without trust, and stability is maintained through restraint rather than cooperation. And within this environment the series introduces Arondir, whose role as an elven Watcher places him at the intersection of authority and empathy, because while he enforces the rules imposed upon the Southlands, he also comes to recognize the human cost of perpetual suspicion, witnessing firsthand how generations born after the war continue to live as suspects rather than citizens, and this recognition creates a quiet tension within him, as he begins to question whether vigilance without forgiveness can ever produce lasting peace. And this tension deepens through his relationship with Bronwyn, a healer whose daily work embodies the struggle to sustain life and dignity in a land defined by external judgment. And through her, the series emphasizes that the Southlands are not a place of latent evil, but of fragile normalcy, where people seek continuity, family, and meaning despite the weight of their history, And yet beneath this fragile surface, signs of disturbance begin to emerge, suggesting that the past has not remained dormant, as villages are abandoned, livestock destroyed, and tunnels discovered beneath the earth, revealing a movement that does not announce itself openly, but advances through secrecy and fear. And this method of emergence mirrors the broader theme of the series, that evil in the Second Age does not return through open banners and armies, but through erosion, infiltration, and the exploitation of neglected spaces. And as Arondir investigates these disturbances, his discovery of underground activity confirms that the Southlands are not merely haunted by memory, but actively threatened by forces seeking to reshape the land itself. And this realization reframes the role of the Elven Watch, because what was once a precaution against a past allegiance becomes insufficient in the face of a new and present danger. And the series underscores this inadequacy by showing the withdrawal of Elven oversight just as the threat begins to materialize, highlighting the tragic timing produced by political decisions made far from the realities they affect, and parallel to this growing instability, the narrative introduces the figure of Halbrand, whose presence among the Southlanders embodies ambiguity and displacement, as he is neither fully accepted nor openly rejected, carrying with him signs of a past that remains deliberately obscured, and his interactions with the people of the region reflect the broader uncertainty that defines the Southlands, a place where identity is fluid, trust is scarce, and survival often requires concealment. And through these intersecting storylines, the series presents the Southlands as a microcosm of Middle-earth's unresolved aftermath, a land caught between imposed order and emerging chaos, where the absence of reconciliation creates fertile ground for the return of darkness. And as the chapter unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that the Southlands are not merely a peripheral setting, but a focal point where the consequences of forgetting, neglect, and inherited blame converge, allowing old symbols, such as the mark associated with the enemy, to regain significance not as relics of the past, but as signals of a future already taking shape. And by the end of this chapter, the Southlands stand revealed as a region poised on the brink of transformation, not because its people are inherently corrupt, but because prolonged mistrust and abandonment have left it vulnerable to forces that thrive where belonging has been denied, reinforcing the series' central assertion that evil does not require universal allegiance to return, only fractures left unhealed and histories left unresolved. The arrival of the stranger marks one of the most disruptive and enigmatic moments in the early narrative of the series, not because it is immediately understood as an act of power, but because it enters the world without context, explanation, or allegiance, arriving literally from the sky in a manner that unsettles both the characters who witness it and the fragile equilibrium of Middle-earth itself. And the series presents this event not as a triumphant descent or a heralded return, but as a violent intrusion, a fiery impact that scars the land and leaves behind confusion rather than clarity, emphasizing from the outset that whatever force has entered the world does not conform to existing expectations of good or evil. And this ambiguity is carefully preserved as the stranger is discovered by the Harfoots, whose perspective shapes the audience's understanding of him during this phase, because their smallness, caution, and instinct for survival frame the event not as a cosmic turning point, but as a dangerous anomaly to be managed quietly. And through this framing, the series reinforces the idea that the most significant changes in the world do not always announce themselves to kings or councils, but often appear first at the margins, where they are misunderstood, feared, or ignored, and the stranger himself is portrayed as disoriented, vulnerable, and largely incapable of communicating intent, his immense power existing alongside a childlike confusion that renders him as much a threat to himself as to others. And this duality is central to his role in the story, because it prevents immediate classification, resisting the narrative impulse to assign him a moral category, and instead positioning him as a question rather than an answer, and as the Harfoots debate what to do with him, their internal conflict reflects a broader thematic tension within the series between the instinct to protect the community by avoiding risk and the impulse to extend compassion even when the outcome is uncertain. And Nori's decision to help the stranger emerges not from heroism or destiny, but from curiosity and empathy, qualities that stand in contrast to the fear-driven calculations that dominate many of the larger powers in Middle-earth. And this contrast is significant because it situates the stranger's arc within a narrative space defined by moral choice, rather than strategic necessity. And as the stranger begins to interact with the world, his attempts to use power are shown to be instinctive rather than controlled, producing unintended consequences that reinforce the danger of his presence, not because of malice, but because of imbalance. And these moments underscore the series' portrayal of power as something that requires understanding and restraint to be constructive, a theme that resonates across multiple storylines. And the Harfoot's efforts to conceal the stranger and minimize disruption further highlight their philosophy of survival, which prioritizes invisibility over influence, suggesting that in a world shaped by great powers, the safest position is often the one that leaves the smallest trace. And yet the very act of sheltering the stranger places them on a path that challenges this philosophy, because his presence inevitably draws attention, fear, and external interest, disrupting the delicate anonymity they rely upon. And this disruption is mirrored by the growing sense that the stranger is being sought, as mysterious figures appear who interpret signs of his arrival not as warnings, but as invitations. And this parallel development deepens the ambiguity surrounding his identity, because it suggests that whatever force he represents is legible to those aligned with darker purposes, even if its nature remains unclear to those who encounter him directly. And the series uses this asymmetry of understanding to build tension, as the audience is made aware that the stranger's presence has implications beyond the immediate safety of the Harfoots, implications that intersect with the broader movements of power and influence unfolding elsewhere in Middle-earth. And yet, despite these looming threats, the stranger's personal journey during this phase remains intimate and grounded, focused on learning, memory, and connection as he begins to associate words, gestures, and emotions with meaning, revealing that his entry into the world is not merely a return, but a beginning, a reorientation that suggests transformation rather than continuation. And this emphasis on becoming rather than being aligns with the series' broader exploration of the Second Age as a time of formation, when identities are still fluid and the future is not yet fixed, and the stranger's struggle to understand his own nature mirrors Middle-earth's struggle to define what peace, vigilance, and responsibility mean in the absence of clear enemies. And as his power grows incrementally, the tension between potential and danger intensifies, raising questions about whether strength without understanding can ever be safely integrated into the world. And these questions remain deliberately unresolved at this stage of the narrative, because the series resists the temptation to reveal too much too soon, allowing uncertainty to function as a narrative force in its own right. And by the end of the chapter, the stranger stands not as a savior or a villain, but as a destabilizing presence whose significance lies precisely in his indeterminacy, embodying the series' central concern with how the world responds to the unknown, whether with fear, control, or compassion. And through his arrival, the narrative asserts that the return of power to Middle-earth will not be orderly or predictable, but fragmented, misunderstood, and deeply contingent on the choices of those who encounter it first, setting in motion a chain of events whose consequences will extend far beyond the quiet clearings where the stranger first took his unsteady steps, and reinforcing the idea that in the Second Age, the greatest transformations begin not in halls of authority, but in moments of quiet decision made by those who possess no power at all. The Harfoots are presented not as heroes in waiting, but as a people defined by caution, memory, and movement. and through their way of life, the series introduces a philosophy of survival that stands in sharp contrast to the ambitions and anxieties of the great powers shaping the Second Age, because the Harfoots do not seek to influence the world, improve it, or leave a lasting mark upon it, but rather to pass through it unnoticed, preserving their community by remaining small, adaptable, and forgotten. And this philosophy is articulated not through speeches or laws, but through ritual, song, and shared custom. As migrations are carefully planned, rules strictly observed, and every decision weighed against the single overriding priority of collective safety. And within this structure, individuality is tolerated only insofar as it does not endanger the group, a tension that becomes central as the stranger's presence challenges the assumptions upon which Harfoot life is built, because sheltering him introduces risk into a system designed to eliminate it. And the series explores this tension not as a simple moral dilemma, but as a collision between two forms of responsibility: the responsibility to protect one's own and the responsibility to respond to suffering beyond one's immediate circle. And as the Harfoots continue their migration, their practices reveal a deep awareness of the dangers that define Middle-earth, as they recount those who have fallen behind, not with cruelty but with solemn acceptance, acknowledging loss as an inevitable consequence of survival, rather than a failure to be prevented at all costs. And this acceptance underscores the fragility of their existence, because while their community is warm and interconnected, it is also bounded by strict necessity, leaving little room for compassion that disrupts balance. And Nori's continued decision to help the stranger therefore places her increasingly at odds with the collective instinct, as her curiosity and empathy challenge the assumption that safety must always come before kindness, and the stranger's growing dependence on her care intensifies this conflict, because his presence cannot be concealed indefinitely, and each act of assistance draws the Harfoots closer to visibility, the very condition they have spent generations avoiding. And the series emphasizes this danger through subtle escalation, as signs of pursuit emerge, and the landscape itself begins to respond to the stranger's power, suggesting that even attempts at concealment may no longer suffice. And yet, despite these mounting risks, the Harfoots do not immediately fracture or reject Nori outright, instead engaging in debate, hesitation, and compromise that reveal the complexity of communal decision-making in a world defined by uncertainty. And this process humanizes their philosophy, showing that their caution is not born of indifference, but of experience, of a long history shaped by loss, marginalization, and the knowledge that larger powers rarely consider the cost of their conflicts on those at the edges of the world. And through this lens, the Harfoot's reluctance to intervene appears not as cowardice, but as a rational response to a world that has repeatedly demonstrated that visibility invites destruction. And yet, the series does not present this philosophy as complete or sufficient, because the stranger's vulnerability introduces a variable that cannot be resolved through tradition alone, forcing the Harfoots to confront the limits of a survival strategy that excludes moral choice. And as the stranger begins to demonstrate both danger and dependence, the Harfoots are confronted with the realization that neutrality is not always possible, because inaction can carry consequences as real as intervention, and this realization marks a subtle but significant shift in their narrative role, transforming them from passive observers into reluctant participants in the unfolding events of the age. And this shift is reinforced by the growing sense that forces beyond their understanding are moving closer, drawn not by the Harfoots themselves, but by the presence they have chosen to protect. And in this way, the series uses the Harfoots to explore a fundamental theme of the Second Age, that even those who seek only to endure cannot remain untouched by the return of power, and that survival, when separated entirely from moral engagement, may preserve life but erode meaning. And as the chapter concludes, the Harfoots stand at a crossroads, still committed to their traditions, yet increasingly aware that the world is changing in ways their customs were not designed to withstand. And through their journey, the series suggests that while invisibility may protect for a time, the emergence of new forces will eventually compel even the smallest and most cautious communities to choose how they will respond to a world that no longer allows them to remain unseen. Khazad-dûm is presented in the series not as a fallen legend or a warning from the past, but as a living civilization at the height of its confidence, prosperity, and ambition, a realm where stone has been shaped into order and abundance through discipline, craft, and an unbroken belief in progress. And this portrayal is essential to understanding its role in the wider narrative, because it situates the dwarves not as victims of inevitable doom, but as active participants in the shaping of the Second Age, guided by choices that appear reasonable, measured, and even admirable within the context of their values. And as the doors of the mountain open to reveal vast halls filled with light, water, and industry, the series emphasizes that Khazad-dûm is not driven by conquest or fear, but by confidence in mastery, a belief that the world can be understood, improved, and controlled through labor and ingenuity. And this belief is embodied most clearly in Prince Durin and Princess Disa, whose leadership style blends pragmatism with aspiration, balancing tradition with the desire to expand the reach and influence of their people. And through them, the series explores how success itself can become a source of vulnerability, because prosperity encourages ambition, and ambition invites risk, particularly when the limits of knowledge are mistaken for obstacles rather than safeguards. And this theme is developed through the introduction of mithril, a substance whose discovery is framed not merely as a stroke of fortune, but as a transformative moment with implications that extend far beyond Khazad-dûm, because mithril is presented as a resource capable of redefining the balance of power, wealth, and survival in Middle-earth, and its emergence introduces a new axis of decision-making, forcing the dwarves to weigh secrecy against opportunity, caution against advancement, and isolation against influence, and these tensions are heightened by the arrival of Elrond, whose relationship with Durin provides a deeply personal lens through which the broader political dynamics are explored, as their friendship reveals the differing perceptions of time, loyalty, and obligation that separate elves and dwarves despite mutual respect, and the strain placed upon this relationship by Elrond's absence underscores one of the series' recurring ideas, that even sincere bonds are tested by the unequal passage of time, and that misunderstanding can arise not from malice, but from fundamentally different experiences of loss and continuity. And as Elrond becomes involved in the internal debates of Khazad-dûm, the series carefully avoids portraying him as an external manipulator, instead presenting his role as ambiguous, shaped by competing loyalties and incomplete truths, which reinforces the sense that no single character fully comprehends the consequences of the choices being made. And this ambiguity is mirrored in the way mithril itself is discussed, as both miracle and risk, salvation and temptation, a duality that aligns it thematically with other sources of power introduced in the series. Because like all transformative forces in the Second Age, Mithril offers solutions to urgent problems while quietly introducing new dependencies, and the dwarves' deliberations over mining deeper into the mountain are framed not as reckless greed, but as a calculated response to pressure, driven by the desire to secure their people's future and assert their relevance in a changing world. And this framing is crucial because it situates their decisions within a moral gray space where intention and outcome are not easily aligned. And, as Princess Disa sings to the stone, communicating with the mountain in a ritual that blends spirituality and craft, the series emphasizes that Khazad-dûm's relationship with the earth is not exploitative but reciprocal, grounded in tradition and reverence. Yet even this reverence cannot fully mitigate the risks introduced by expansion, because respect does not guarantee understanding, and understanding does not eliminate consequence. And as the chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that Khazad-dûm stands at a pivotal moment where continued restraint may preserve stability but limit potential, while expansion promises prosperity at the cost of uncertainty. And this dilemma encapsulates the broader condition of Middle-earth in the Second Age, a world rich with opportunity, yet increasingly strained by the desire to control forces that are only partially understood. And, through Khazad-dûm's portrayal, the series articulates one of its most subtle warnings, that decline is not always precipitated by corruption or malice, but often by confidence, by the belief that success justifies risk, and that mastery over the present ensures safety in the future. And as the dwarves of Khazad-dûm continue to thrive, their halls filled with light and purpose, the audience is invited to recognize both the achievement and the fragility of a civilization standing at its zenith, unaware that the very conditions enabling its greatness are also shaping the pressures that will one day test its foundations, reinforcing the series' central tension between growth and restraint, and leaving open the question of whether even the most disciplined and united societies can expand without eventually confronting the limits of their own ambition. The relationship between Elrond and Durin serves as one of the most intimate and emotionally grounded threads of the series, not because it alters the course of history directly, but because it reveals how time itself functions as a dividing force between peoples who otherwise share respect, affection, and shared memory, and through their reunion in Khazad-dûm, the series explores the quiet tragedy of long lives intersecting with shorter ones, as Elrond's decades-long absence, insignificant by elven reckoning, is experienced by Durin as a profound personal abandonment, encompassing marriage, parenthood, and the slow accumulation of lived experience that Elrond was not present to witness. And this imbalance immediately reframes their friendship, transforming what Elrond remembers as continuity into a wound that has never healed for Durin. And the series allows this conflict to unfold not through accusation or hostility, but through restrained dialogue, silence, and ritual, emphasizing that misunderstandings rooted in time are often the most difficult to articulate, because they are not the result of betrayal, but of incompatible perceptions of loss. And as Elrond seeks reconciliation, his efforts are marked by sincerity, yet constrained by the diplomatic purpose that brought him to Khazad-dûm, creating a tension between personal loyalty and broader obligation that mirrors the challenges faced by many characters in the series. And Durin's guarded response reflects not cruelty or pride, but self-protection, a refusal to reopen bonds that time has rendered asymmetrical. And this dynamic is further complicated by Princess Disa, whose presence introduces both warmth and firmness, serving as a stabilizing force within Durin's life, while also recognizing the potential value of renewed friendship. And through her perspective, the series highlights the necessity of balancing past grievance with future possibility, particularly in a world where alliances may soon become essential for survival. And as Elrond is drawn deeper into the internal concerns of Khazad-dûm, the trust between him and Durin becomes a contested resource, negotiated through acts rather than promises, because words alone cannot bridge the gap created by unequal lifespans. And this negotiation culminates in moments where loyalty is tested not through grand sacrifice, but through restraint, secrecy, and the willingness to respect boundaries. And Elrond's gradual understanding of Durin's pain marks a subtle evolution in his character, as he begins to grasp that diplomacy cannot be effective if it ignores the emotional realities of those it seeks to persuade. And this realization reshapes his approach, shifting him away from persuasion rooted in necessity toward engagement grounded in empathy. And the series uses this shift to illustrate how trust is rebuilt, not by erasing the past, but by acknowledging its weight. And this acknowledgement becomes particularly significant as the question of Mithril enters their shared orbit, because the substance represents both opportunity and danger, and how it is discussed, concealed, or revealed becomes a measure of trust between friends whose histories no longer align neatly. And as Durin grapples with his responsibilities as prince and friend, the series presents leadership not as authority alone, but as the burden of choosing which truths to share and which to protect, especially when revelation carries risks that extend beyond personal consequence. And through these interactions, the narrative reframes the grand events of the Second Age as the sum of countless private negotiations, where the fate of alliances is determined not only by strategy, but by the willingness of individuals to confront discomfort, forgive without forgetting, and accept that mutual respect does not eliminate difference. And by the end of this chapter, the bond between Elrond and Durin remains imperfect but renewed, no longer defined by unspoken resentment, yet not fully restored to its former ease, reflecting the series' broader depiction of Middle-earth as a world where harmony, once broken, can be repaired only through effort, patience, and the acceptance that time alters relationships in ways that cannot be undone, but can still be navigated. And in presenting this friendship at the heart of political and material concerns, the series emphasizes that the survival of civilizations often depends as much on the resilience of personal bonds as on armies, resources, or foresight, suggesting that even in an age of rising powers and gathering shadows, the most consequential acts may remain quiet, human, and deeply shaped by the passage of time itself. Numenor is introduced in the series as a realm defined not by decay or weakness, but by inward tension, a powerful island kingdom whose greatest struggle is no longer external threat, but the question of how it understands its place in the world. And this inward turn is framed through a society that has deliberately chosen distance over engagement, closing itself off from Middle-earth not out of fear, but out of a growing conviction that its destiny should be self-determined and insulated from the conflicts of others. And this posture of isolation is reflected in the political atmosphere of the island, where authority is cautious, public sentiment is divided, and memory of past alliances has faded into abstraction, replaced by concern for stability, sovereignty, and control. And into this carefully balanced environment arrive Galadriel and Halbrand, whose presence immediately disrupts the equilibrium, not because they wield armies or influence, but because they embody unresolved connections to a wider world Numenor has attempted to forget, and Galadriel's arrival exposes the fragility of Númenórean neutrality, as her very existence challenges the narrative that the age of great conflicts is over, while Halbrand's ambiguous status unsettles social boundaries and awakens latent suspicions about lineage, loyalty, and power. And the series uses these disruptions to explore how isolation, once adopted as policy, reshapes identity, encouraging societies to reinterpret former virtues as liabilities and former alliances as threats. And this reinterpretation is visible in the tension between the ruling authority and the populace, as public unrest reveals anxiety about elven presence and influence, suggesting that fear of the past has been transmuted into fear of contamination. And through these scenes, Númenor is portrayed not as hostile by nature, but as defensive, a society attempting to preserve internal cohesion by limiting external engagement. And yet this defensiveness masks deeper uncertainty, because the island's prosperity and strength have created expectations of permanence that are increasingly difficult to reconcile with a world still subject to change and loss. And this uncertainty is embodied in Queen Regent Miriel, whose leadership is defined by restraint, foresight, and the burden of inherited responsibility, as she navigates competing pressures from tradition, public opinion, and personal conviction. And her cautious approach underscores the central dilemma of Númenor's inward turn, whether power is best preserved through distance or through engagement. And as Galadriel presses for alliance and intervention, the resistance she encounters reveals not indifference to Middle-earth's fate, but a fear that involvement will reignite conflicts Numenor believes it has outgrown. And this fear is reinforced by the presence of political figures who interpret any concession as weakness, advocating instead for a future defined by independence and dominance rather than cooperation, and the series carefully avoids simplifying this divide, presenting Numenor's inward turn as a response shaped by historical experience rather than malice, because the island's people have witnessed the cost of entanglement and now seek security in separation, and yet this security proves illusory, as the arrival of external forces and internal unrest demonstrate that isolation cannot fully shield a society from the consequences of the wider world. And as the chapter unfolds, Numenor's streets, courts, and harbors become sites of quiet contestation, where speeches, arrests, and symbolic gestures reveal how quickly neutrality can transform into coercion when challenged. And through these developments, the series positions Numenor at a critical juncture, no longer able to maintain the fiction that it can remain untouched by the resurgence of power elsewhere, and the inward turn that once promised stability begins to generate its own form of instability, as suppression replaces dialogue and fear replaces trust. And by the end of this chapter, Numenor stands revealed as a society on the threshold of decision, its strength unquestioned but its direction uncertain, confronted with the realization that withdrawal from history does not prevent history from returning, and that the choice to look inward while offering temporary calm may ultimately leave the island unprepared for the consequences of a world that continues to move beyond its shores, setting the stage for deeper divisions and more consequential choices that will determine whether Numenor remains a passive observer or becomes an active force in the unfolding struggle of the age. The division between the faithful and the Kingsmen emerges in the series not as an abrupt schism, but as the gradual crystallization of anxieties that have long simmered beneath Numenor's outward stability, revealing how ideological fault lines form when a powerful society struggles to reconcile its past with its present. And this division is portrayed less through doctrine than through attitude, as competing visions of Numenor's identity begin to surface in response to the island's renewed contact with Middle-earth and the return of forces thought long resolved. And within this context, the faithful are depicted as those who maintain a sense of historical continuity, viewing Numenor's greatness as inseparable from its former alliances and moral commitments, while the Kingsmen represent a growing confidence that the island's power should be self-contained, unencumbered by external loyalties or inherited obligations. And the series carefully avoids framing either group as purely virtuous or villainous at this stage, instead presenting their divergence as the product of fear, pride, and uncertainty shared across the society. And this ambiguity is reinforced through the political dynamics surrounding Queen Regent Miriel, whose authority depends on navigating between these competing currents without provoking open unrest, as her restraint is interpreted by some as wisdom and by others as weakness. And this perception fuels the influence of voices who argue that Numenor's future lies in assertion rather than accommodation, and as Galadriel's presence continues to agitate public sentiment, the divide deepens, because she becomes a symbol onto which broader concerns are projected, embodying for some the reminder of ancient bonds and for others the threat of renewed subordination to external powers. And this symbolic role amplifies existing tensions, transforming political disagreement into cultural polarization, as allegiance becomes a marker of identity rather than policy preference. And through scenes of public confrontation and private counsel, the series illustrates how fear of loss can be redirected into resentment, particularly when prosperity has fostered the expectation of permanence. And this redirection is visible in the rhetoric of the Kingsmen, who frame independence as liberation and cooperation as vulnerability, recasting Numenor's former openness as a liability that must be corrected. And yet, the faithful's position is shown to be equally complex, because their attachment to tradition is not merely nostalgic, but rooted in concern that severing ties with the wider world will erode the moral framework that has sustained the island's unity. And this concern is articulated not through grand declarations, but through quiet acts of remembrance, language, and loyalty, emphasizing that their resistance to change is motivated by preservation rather than control. And as these two orientations collide, the series highlights the mechanisms by which political divisions harden, as suspicion replaces dialogue, and authority is increasingly exercised through enforcement rather than consent. And this hardening is evident in the treatment of dissent, as arrests and intimidation signal a shift from debate to coercion, revealing how easily the pursuit of stability can undermine the very cohesion it seeks to protect. And throughout this process, Halbrand's ambiguous position within Númenórean society mirrors the broader uncertainty of the age, as his ascent and acceptance reveal the island's readiness to embrace figures who promise strength and decisiveness, even when their origins remain obscure, suggesting that in times of division, societies may prioritize perceived capability over trust, and this prioritization further accelerates the drift toward authoritarian solutions, reinforcing the Kingsmen's influence and marginalizing voices that call for caution and continuity. And by the end of this chapter, the divide between the faithful and the Kingsmen is no longer merely ideological, but institutional, embedded within Númenor's governance and public life, transforming difference of opinion into a structural tension that will shape every subsequent decision. And through this portrayal, the series presents Númenor's internal conflict as a warning about the fragility of unity in powerful societies, illustrating how strength, when paired with fear of decline, can give rise to movements that redefine loyalty as exclusion and security as dominance, setting Númenor on a path where the question is no longer whether it will act, but how its actions will reflect the values it chooses to uphold or abandon, as the shadows of the wider world draw ever closer. The road to war in the Southlands is not depicted in the series as a sudden eruption of violence, but as the gradual convergence of fear, misinformation, and long-ignored warning signs, revealing how conflict often emerges not from a single decisive act, but from the accumulation of unresolved tensions, as villages already strained by suspicion and scarcity begin to experience coordinated attacks that cannot be dismissed as isolated incidents. And through these developments, the narrative emphasizes that the return of war is felt first at the margins, where defenses are weakest and attention from distant powers is slow to arrive. And as Arondir is captured and taken beneath the earth, the series shifts perspective from observation to entrapment, showing how the enemy operates not through open confrontation, but through enforced labor and psychological domination, compelling captives to reshape the land itself in service of an unseen purpose. And this method of warfare underscores a central theme of the season, that control over geography is inseparable from control over people, because by forcing the Southlanders to dig tunnels and trenches, the enemy transforms the environment into a weapon, while simultaneously eroding resistance through exhaustion and fear. And as Arondir witnesses the organization and discipline of these forces, it becomes clear that what is unfolding is not a random resurgence of violence, but a coordinated campaign driven by intent rather than chaos. And parallel to this escalation, the communities of the Southlands are shown struggling to maintain cohesion, as old mistrust resurfaces and leadership is contested, revealing how quickly survival pressures can fracture fragile alliances. And Bronwyn's emergence as a leader is framed not as ambition, but as necessity, as her ability to inspire cooperation becomes the only barrier against disintegration. And through her, the series explores how authority can arise organically in moments of crisis, grounded in care and proximity rather than lineage or decree, And yet, even as resistance organizes, the imbalance of power remains stark, because the enemy's strategy relies not on numbers alone, but on inevitability, advancing slowly, methodically, and with an apparent understanding that fear itself will accomplish much of the work, and this inevitability is reinforced by the appearance of Adar, whose presence reframes the conflict by introducing a figure who articulates purpose and justification, transforming violence into ideology, and positioning the campaign in the Southlands as an act of reclamation rather than conquest. And through Adar, the series complicates the nature of the enemy, presenting a leader who speaks not in terms of domination for its own sake, but of refuge, identity, and survival for those cast aside by previous ages. And this reframing destabilizes the moral clarity of the conflict without diminishing its brutality, because while Adar's motivations are articulated, their consequences remain devastating for those caught in their path. And as Halbrand returns to the Southlands, his connection to the land introduces further ambiguity, as his knowledge of its people and terrain suggests a past entanglement that carries both authority and risk, and his willingness to fight is portrayed not as redemption completed, but as an unresolved negotiation with identity. And as preparations for defense accelerate, the series emphasizes the asymmetry of the coming conflict, as improvised fortifications and civilian militias stand against a force that has already shaped the battlefield to its advantage. And this asymmetry heightens the sense of impending catastrophe, because the outcome appears determined less by courage than by timing and coordination. And as Númenórean intervention begins to take form, the road to war expands beyond the Southlands themselves, revealing how local crises draw distant powers into entanglement, often before the full nature of the conflict is understood. And this expansion reinforces the interconnectedness of the season's narratives, as decisions made in isolation ripple outward, binding disparate peoples into a shared trajectory toward confrontation. And by the end of this chapter, the Southlands are no longer a neglected frontier, but the focal point of converging ambitions, fears, and misunderstandings, a place where the refusal to reconcile the past has given rise to a war shaped as much by memory and identity as by force. And through this unfolding, the series presents the road to war, not as a failure of vigilance alone, but as the consequence of delayed recognition, illustrating how conflicts become inevitable when warning signs are acknowledged too late and unity is forged only under the pressure of imminent loss, setting the stage for a confrontation that will transform the land itself and redefine the stakes of the Second Age as depicted on screen. The transformation of the Southlands unfolds not as an unforeseen disaster, but as the culmination of a plan long concealed beneath layers of misdirection, labor, and sacrifice. And the series presents this moment as the point at which scattered threads of tension converge into irreversible change, because what had appeared as a series of localized attacks and defensive skirmishes is revealed to be part of a deliberate design aimed not merely at victory, but at the reshaping of the land itself. And as Númenórean forces arrive and temporarily turn the tide of battle, the sense of relief that follows is framed as fragile and incomplete, suggesting that success achieved through force does not necessarily equate to the resolution of deeper threats. And this fragility becomes evident as the conflict's apparent conclusion exposes how little the defenders understand the true objective of their enemy. Because while the Southlanders celebrate survival and the restoration of control, the mechanisms set in motion beneath their feet remain active, awaiting a final trigger. And this trigger arrives through the use of the hilt, an object whose significance has been misunderstood and underestimated throughout the season, treated alternately as a symbol, a weapon, or a burden, but never fully recognized as a key. And when it is finally activated, the series reveals the scale of the deception that has guided events, as the tunnels carved by forced labor serve their ultimate purpose, redirecting water into the heart of the land's volcanic system, and this redirection transforms geography into a weapon, unleashing fire, ash, and devastation on a scale that dwarfs all previous conflict, and the eruption itself is depicted not as a sudden anomaly, but as the logical outcome of sustained manipulation, emphasizing that the most catastrophic changes are often engineered patiently rather than imposed violently. And as the landscape is consumed by darkness, the series shifts focus from spectacle to consequence, showing how survival becomes immediate and arbitrary, determined by proximity, chance, and resilience rather than heroism. And this emphasis reinforces the idea that war's most enduring legacy is not victory or defeat, but displacement, trauma, and loss, as entire communities are erased or scattered in moments. And the birth of Mordor is thus framed not as the founding of a kingdom through conquest, but as the creation of a wasteland through calculated destruction, transforming a once inhabited region into a domain defined by hostility to life itself. And this transformation recontextualizes the season's earlier conflicts, revealing that control over people was always secondary to control over the land, because by rendering the Southlands uninhabitable to most, the enemy secures a territory that requires no allegiance, only endurance. And this strategy marks a shift in the nature of power portrayed in the series, moving away from domination through loyalty toward domination through environment, where survival itself becomes contingent on submission. And as the survivors grapple with shock and grief, the series underscores how ill-prepared they were for a threat that operated beyond conventional warfare, because their defenses were designed to repel armies, not inevitability. And this unpreparedness exposes the limits of reactive leadership, as decisions made under pressure fail to account for long-term consequences. And the naming of Mordor crystallizes this transformation, not as a declaration of rule, but as an acknowledgement that the land has crossed a threshold from contested territory to permanent scar. And through this naming, the series emphasizes that some changes cannot be undone through negotiation or force, because they alter the conditions under which life itself persists. And as ash settles and the sky darkens, the narrative reframes the season's stakes, shifting attention from the prevention of war to the management of its aftermath, because the question is no longer whether darkness will return, but how the world will adapt to its presence. And in this sense, the birth of Mordor represents the most consequential event of the season, not because it introduces a new enemy, but because it establishes a permanent source of imbalance that will shape every subsequent decision, alliance, and conflict. And by presenting this transformation as the result of overlooked warnings and misunderstood intentions, the series reinforces its central theme that evil in the Second Age does not arrive suddenly or honestly, but through processes that exploit distraction, optimism, and the assumption that threats can always be confronted on familiar terms, leaving behind a world irrevocably altered by the cost of delayed understanding. In the aftermath of destruction, the series shifts its focus from open conflict to subtler forms of influence, revealing how power in this age often operates not through spectacle but through proximity, trust, and the careful management of perception. And it is within this quieter phase that the true danger of what has been overlooked begins to emerge, because while the survivors of the Southlands struggle to orient themselves amid ash and loss, attention turns toward figures whose presence has long been normalized, accepted, and even relied upon, demonstrating how familiarity can obscure threat more effectively than secrecy. And this dynamic is most clearly illustrated through Halbrand, whose role evolves from displaced survivor to valued leader, not through conquest or assertion, but through competence, shared hardship, and the ability to articulate purpose in moments of uncertainty. And the series carefully constructs this ascent to feel organic rather than manipulative, emphasizing that trust is often granted incrementally, built through small acts that align with immediate needs rather than long-term scrutiny. And as Halbrand assumes greater responsibility, his guidance is framed as pragmatic and stabilizing, offering direction at a time when traditional structures have collapsed. And this framing is critical because it illustrates how authority can emerge in the absence of clear legitimacy, filling vacuums created by crisis. And parallel to this development, Galadriel's role shifts as well, as her certainty is tested by the consequences of alliance and intervention, forcing her to confront the possibility that vigilance, when paired with incomplete understanding, can inadvertently enable the very forces it seeks to oppose. And this internal tension adds complexity to her interactions, as she balances urgency with reflection, increasingly aware that the enemy's methods may not align with her expectations of confrontation. And within Númenor, the reverberations of recent decisions continue to unfold, as involvement in the Southlands has altered the island's sense of detachment, making it impossible to fully retreat from the wider world without acknowledging the costs already incurred. And this acknowledgement deepens internal divisions, as competing interpretations of responsibility, blame, and future action intensify, revealing how the exercise of power abroad reshapes authority at home. And the series uses these parallel arcs to underscore a central theme, that power most effectively reshapes societies when it is perceived as necessary rather than imposed, because necessity accelerates acceptance and suppresses doubt. And as attention remains focused on visible devastation, less visible shifts occur in allegiance, influence, and narrative control, allowing those who understand the mechanics of trust to move with minimal resistance. And this pattern is reinforced through the continued ambiguity surrounding the stranger, whose presence draws scrutiny and fear precisely because his power is visible yet uncontrolled, creating a contrast with figures whose influence grows precisely because it is subtle, relational, and embedded within existing structures. And through this contrast, the series highlights the asymmetry between overt and covert power, suggesting that the greatest transformations often occur without dramatic markers, taking place within conversations, decisions, and moments of shared vulnerability. And as the chapter unfolds, the sense of unease grows not from immediate threat, but from the realization that the world is adjusting to new centers of influence without fully recognizing them as such. And this adjustment is portrayed not as ignorance, but as fatigue, as societies recovering from trauma prioritize stability and reassurance over suspicion, creating conditions in which manipulation can thrive unnoticed. And by the end of this chapter, the series makes clear that the most consequential developments of the age are no longer confined to battlefields or ruined landscapes, but are unfolding within networks of trust, leadership, and identity, where power hides not behind masks, but behind acceptance, preparing the ground for revelations that will reframe the meaning of loyalty, foresight, and responsibility in a world still struggling to comprehend the full scope of the darkness it has allowed to take root. The revelation of Sauron does not arrive in the series as a thunderous declaration or a moment of theatrical dominance, but as a quiet and unsettling realignment of meaning, in which past events are reframed through the recognition that the greatest danger was never distant or hidden, but present, familiar, and trusted. And this restraint is central to how the series presents the unveiling, because it emphasizes that deception of this magnitude succeeds not through elaborate disguise alone, but through the careful cultivation of proximity, empathy, and shared purpose, allowing the truth to remain invisible precisely because it aligns so closely with what others wish to believe. And as Galadriel begins to recognize the pattern that binds together disparate moments of guidance, survival, and influence, the series shifts from external conflict to internal reckoning, showing how the realization of betrayal carries a weight that far exceeds the shock of discovery, because it forces a confrontation not only with an enemy, but with one's own assumptions, judgments, and choices. And this confrontation unfolds not through accusation, but through memory, as earlier encounters take on new significance, revealing how advice that once appeared pragmatic was in fact directional, steering events toward outcomes that served a concealed design, and the series carefully avoids presenting this revelation as a failure of intelligence, instead framing it as the consequence of trust extended in good faith during moments of vulnerability, underscoring that the most effective deception operates by mirroring virtue rather than opposing it. And as the truth emerges, the contrast between overt darkness and concealed ambition becomes stark, highlighting how easily vigilance can be misdirected toward visible threats, while subtler forces reshape the world unnoticed. And this misdirection is embodied in the figure revealed as Sauron, whose presence has been defined not by command or intimidation, but by adaptability, patience, and an acute understanding of how crises create opportunities for influence. And through this portrayal, the series reframes the concept of power, presenting it not as domination imposed from above, but as alignment with the desires and fears of others, allowing control to emerge through consent rather than coercion. And Galadriel's response to this revelation is depicted as a moment of profound isolation, because recognition brings responsibility without immediate recourse, forcing her to confront the implications of acting on incomplete certainty. And this isolation underscores one of the series' most persistent themes, that foresight often carries a burden that cannot be easily shared or validated until consequences are already in motion. And as the confrontation between Galadriel and Sauron unfolds, it is marked not by violence but by dialogue, a deliberate choice that reinforces the nature of the threat, because words, rather than weapons, are shown to be the primary instruments through which the future is shaped at this stage, and Sauron's articulation of his vision is framed as seductive not because it is false, but because it offers solutions to genuine problems: order in the face of chaos, healing after devastation, and purpose amid uncertainty, revealing how his appeal lies in addressing real wounds with answers that appear compassionate yet demand submission. And this articulation forces Galadriel to confront the ambiguity of her own quest, as the line between vigilance and obsession blurs, and the series uses this tension to explore how the pursuit of righteousness can be manipulated when it becomes detached from humility, and as the chapter progresses, the revelation extends beyond personal betrayal to structural implication, because it becomes clear that Sauron's concealment has already shaped events in ways that cannot be undone through exposure alone, embedding his influence within systems, alliances, and expectations that will persist even after his departure. And this persistence reframes the meaning of victory and failure, suggesting that unmasking an enemy does not equate to neutralizing their impact. And by presenting the revelation in this measured, reflective manner, the series emphasizes that the true danger of Sauron lies not in his identity, but in the methods he employs, methods that rely on patience, persuasion, and the exploitation of noble intentions. And as the chapter closes, the world of the series is irrevocably altered, not because a secret has been revealed, but because the recognition of that secret forces a reassessment of trust itself, leaving characters and societies to grapple with the realization that the most devastating threats are not always those that announce themselves with fire and shadow, but those that walk openly among allies, shaping outcomes while appearing to seek the same ends. And through this revelation, the series solidifies its central warning that in an age defined by recovery and uncertainty, the desire for healing can itself become the pathway through which darkness returns, not by opposing the light, but by standing beside it, offering guidance that leads quietly and decisively toward domination. The forging of the rings is presented in the series not as a moment of triumph or destiny fulfilled, but as an act born from urgency, uncertainty, and the narrowing of choices, unfolding in an atmosphere where time itself feels compressed. and consequences loom larger than understanding, because the decision to create the rings arises not from ambition or conquest, but from a desperate attempt to preserve what is perceived to be slipping away. And this framing is essential to the series' portrayal, as it situates creation within a context of fear rather than confidence, emphasizing that the most powerful artifacts of the age emerge not from mastery, but from crisis, and as Celebrimbor and the elven smiths labor under mounting pressure, the process is defined by improvisation, collaboration, and the willingness to accept incomplete knowledge in exchange for immediate hope. And this willingness reflects the broader condition of Middle-earth at this stage, where the desire to halt decline outweighs the caution that might otherwise govern such profound acts. And the series carefully illustrates how necessity reshapes ethics, as boundaries that once seemed inviolate become negotiable when survival appears at stake. And within this environment, guidance offered earlier takes on a new and unsettling resonance, as methods, principles, and conceptual frameworks introduced in moments of trust are now applied independently, revealing how influence can persist even in absence. And the forging itself is depicted with restraint, focusing not on spectacle but on process, on the delicate balance between materials, intention, and restraint, underscoring that power in this age is not summoned through domination, but assembled through cooperation and risk. And the decision to divide power rather than concentrate it marks a pivotal departure from earlier assumptions, reflecting an attempt to correct perceived dangers through distribution rather than control. And yet this solution carries its own uncertainties, because division does not eliminate influence, but alters how it flows. And the series emphasizes this ambiguity by presenting the rings not as instruments of command, but as preservers, tools meant to slow decay and sustain what already exists. And this intention complicates the moral landscape, because preservation, while seemingly benign, can become indistinguishable from stagnation when pursued without acceptance of change. And as the rings take shape, the narrative underscores the absence of complete consensus, as decisions are made under pressure and with limited foresight, revealing that even acts undertaken with care can embed vulnerabilities when driven by fear of loss. And this tension is heightened by the awareness that the forging occurs after deception has already shaped events, meaning that even corrective action unfolds within a framework influenced by manipulation. And yet, the series resists presenting this moment as a failure of wisdom alone, instead portraying it as a human response to overwhelming threat, rooted in the hope that careful creation might succeed where force has failed. And this hope gives the rings their emotional weight, because they represent not domination, but the refusal to surrender to inevitability. And as the chapter concludes, the forging stands as a turning point, not because it resolves the conflict of the season, but because it formalizes a new approach to power, one that seeks balance through restraint, yet remains vulnerable to the very dynamics it aims to counter. And through this portrayal, the series reinforces its central theme that in the Second Age, even the most thoughtful solutions are shaped by incomplete understanding, and that acts of preservation, when undertaken under the shadow of fear, can carry consequences that extend far beyond their original intent, setting the stage for an uncertain future in which the tools created to protect the world will themselves become central to its unfolding fate. What remains at the end of the season is not resolution, but redefinition, as the series closes not by sealing conflicts or restoring balance, but by clarifying the shape of a world that has irreversibly changed, revealing that the Second Age, as portrayed on screen, is an era no longer defined by recovery from past wars, but by the quiet establishment of forces that will determine the future long before open confrontation resumes. And this redefinition is visible across every storyline, as characters emerge altered not only by what they have endured, but by what they now understand about power, trust, and consequence. And in the lands once known as the Southlands, that transformation into Mordor stands as the most tangible reminder that loss cannot always be undone, because the land itself has been reshaped into a domain hostile to life, forcing survivors to confront displacement as a permanent condition rather than a temporary hardship. And this permanence reframes the meaning of survival, shifting it from resistance to adaptation, as those who remain must decide how to live in the shadow of an environment that now embodies domination rather than contest. And, in parallel, the forging of the rings leaves the elves with tools born of hope and anxiety, artifacts created not to rule but to preserve, yet carrying within them the uncertainty of influence that cannot be fully measured, and this uncertainty hangs over their future decisions, as preservation becomes both a refuge and a potential trap, encouraging the maintenance of what is rather than acceptance of change. And within Numenor, the season concludes with tensions unresolved, as involvement in Middle-earth has fractured the illusion of isolation without yet producing consensus, leaving the island poised between competing visions of identity, authority, and destiny. And this unresolved state underscores the fragility of power rooted in balance rather than conviction, suggesting that restraint, while stabilizing in the short term, may struggle to endure prolonged pressure. And among the Harfoots, the journey continues marked by loss and expansion of awareness, as their encounter with forces beyond their understanding forces them to reconsider the limits of invisibility as a strategy, revealing that survival through concealment carries costs when the world itself grows less predictable. And the stranger's departure crystallizes this shift, not as a conclusion to his arc, but as a transition toward purpose, indicating that power, once awakened, cannot remain indefinitely undefined, and must eventually align with intention. And across these disparate paths, the season leaves behind a unifying realization that the greatest danger is no longer ignorance of the past, but confidence in incomplete knowledge, as characters move forward equipped with partial truths that shape their choices as powerfully as certainty once did. And this condition defines the tone of what follows, because the age that emerges is not one of clear sides or immediate war, but of preparation, positioning, and the quiet normalization of influence, as systems begin to form around decisions made under pressure rather than reflection. And through this ending, the series emphasizes that endings themselves are illusions, because what appears to be closure is often the foundation of future conflict, laid quietly and without ceremony. And as the final moments settle, the world of the series stands suspended between what has been lost and what is being built, a world where power no longer announces itself with banners or armies, but embeds itself within landscapes, alliances, and intentions, waiting for the moment when its full weight will be felt. And in this suspension lies the enduring tension of the season's conclusion, the sense that while the visible story has paused, the deeper currents shaping Middle-earth have only just begun to move, carrying forward choices, compromises, and consequences that will define the path ahead long before their outcomes are fully understood.